This is good coming after Matt of the Find Your Dream Job, because I actually found my dream not job. So, but I'm not going to talk about that. How many of you out there, when the pressure comes and the deadline is coming up soon, drop back to ways that you know you probably shouldn't code that way? It's stuff you used to do, and there's the whole, well, I know that I really should abide by single responsibility, or I know that I really should test, or I know that I really should do this, but when the time comes, it's just faster to crank the code out. And it's sort of the dissonance between getting it done and doing it the way that you think you really should, or you know you should do it. You should abide by the solid principles. You should, unless you're some people who don't agree with the solid principles, but we won't go into that. And I harken it back to how many people did non-OO languages before they got into one? How many, when you started doing an OO language, when the pressure came on, you dropped back into writing kind of procedural code? Do you do that now? When the pressure's on, you still build your objects, and for the most part, you probably build a reasonable design. You don't drop back to ASP Classic, writing VB script. You build a couple objects. Maybe you don't abide by single responsibility as much as you should. How come? How come now you don't fall back to the old procedural pre-OO stuff that you did? You fall back into some principles that you learned when you started. And the reason that you don't is because over the course of a couple years, the OO stuff became your default techniques. When the time comes and the pressure comes on you, you fall back to what's under your fingers. The thing that is your technique. This is what I've been doing for a few years. This is what I know. And so, for some reason now, there's a different, I know I need to do that, but I gotta get it done. Well, how many people are musicians? There's probably, say, half. How many people have fooled around with an instrument don't want to call themselves a musician? How many people were guitar? At least got to the point where you could play a 3-chord song, which is most all rock and roll. Okay. When you learned, I'm going to take the key of G, GCD. Standard 1-4-5. It's pretty much every song you would ever want to play around a campfire you can play with GCD. How many of you felt at a certain point that you could change from the G chord to the C chord relatively quick enough to where the song didn't sound horrible and people were willing to sing with it? Anybody? A few people. Okay. You don't learn to change chords in guitar by playing a song and going, I played that song, and you move on to a new song and you play that song, and then you move on to another song and you play that song, hoping that someday you're going to be able to actually change from a G chord to a C chord fluently so that it's there and you don't have to think about it and it sounds like a song. Instead, what you do is you play the G chord, and then you play the C chord, and then you play the G chord, and then you play the C chord, and you practice. You practice switching from the G chord to the C chord over and over and over. And it wasn't that long ago, a few years ago, when the B minor chord was my enemy. I hated the B minor chord. It's this crazy chord like this. If you don't bar it, you do that. And switching from a D to a B minor it was awful. And I like to play a lot of Neil Young. And if you play a lot of Neil Young, most everything's in G. And he loves that B minor chord. He flips to it all the time. And it took me a long time to get there, but the way I got there is I spent an hour and I just did D, B minor, D, B minor, D, B minor. Then I went to G, B minor, G, B minor. Did these sorts of things. How come we don't do that in software? The way that we generally learn and practice in code is the same thing of playing a song, then playing a completely new song, and then a new song, and then a new song. We don't do those specific steps that allow you to learn a small technique. How many people do TDD? How many people do TDD? 100% of the time. When the deadline looms, you do TDD. How come? Is it because it slows you down? How come?
Just because when it comes down to crunch time, I feel like it gets hard. Like it's challenging to write the test when I know that I have to deliver it, and that's one more thing I need to do instead of just writing the code. It's a challenge.
It's a challenge. It's hard until it's under your fingers, until it's the way that you code. It slows you down.
There's another point too.
Okay.
My boss doesn't care about that test that I wrote. He cares about that thing that comes out at the end. He won't know one way or another whether that's tested there, except when it breaks. Then he'll know, but he won't know that because I didn't write the test.
Yeah. So your boss doesn't care. Your boss doesn't care that you have tests. Your boss cares that you deliver it. In the end, all of these arguments, your boss honestly doesn't care how you write the code. Your boss cares that the code gets written. If you get it up in time, your boss isn't going to come in there, or he shouldn't, and if he does, you should tell him to mind his own business. Your boss isn't going to come into your source control system and go, I noticed that you checked in a file called something tests. Don't do it. Your boss wants you to hit the deadline. The reason that you can't hit the deadline most of the time, most of the things that I hear, is because of the fact that when you do TDD, it slows you down. When you do single responsibility, it's slower than just writing all the code in the method. When you do inversion of control, when you do, let's go, all of the design principles that you know that you should. The reason it slows you down is because it's not under your fingers. So what I'm challenging everyone to do is start thinking about practicing those small techniques. Do a small project, very small. Say, write code, TDD, everything refactored, simplest thing possible, that replaces a token in a string, a $ name. And it searches a string, replaces all instances of $ token with the value from a hash that you pass in. Do this exercise. You do this exercise, you write your specs. I did it, it takes about 7 specs. Come in, it's about 3 lines of Ruby code. You do it 10 times. That helps drill in the flow of spec, code, refactor, spec, code, refactor, spec, code, refactor. Then go in and do something like write a Sudoku solver. Write a Sudoku solver and then delete your code. And then write your Sudoku solver and delete your code again. How many people here know how to do a multi-dimensional array in Ruby without looking at Ruby docs? I don't. Absolutely not. I would have to look in Ruby docs. How many of you, right off the top of your head, know how to use GSub? Excellent. 2 people, 3, 4, a few people. I didn't. I had to look at RubyDoc. I was looking, what actually comes out in the match that gets passed to the block that you do? Well, you know what? I did it about 10 times. I now know what comes out. And you know what? It includes the $. How do you get, say the match comes out, it has $ name. How do you actually get the rest of the string minus the $? The match comes out and it comes into your block and it's $ name. It comes in as match.
I would use parentheses around the text and access it through one of those numeric.
Well, we're not Perl programmers, okay? No magic variables. No magic variables. But these are the things. Well, you can grab everything but the first character by taking the string and indexing 1 ... -1. It gets you everything there. It took me 2 or 3 tries to figure out how to do that. But you know what? I know now because I've written it 10 times. And so, in conclusion, I would challenge you all to take those things. Every time you look at RubyDoc, For the API for some method call, find a small little task that you can write that exposes and drills that into your head so that it's under your fingers. And do it 10 times. It takes 15 minutes to do it. And the savings are just tremendous over the long term. Take a half an hour a day and practice the fundamentals of the language you're in. Practice using iterator methods. Practice using map. Practice using inject. Practice using some of these things so that when the time comes, you don't have to fall back on old ways. The ways that you know you should do it come out from your fingers when the pressure's on. And over time, you expand it up to design principles, to TDD, to all of these things. And eventually, 10 years from now, I'm going to stand up here, you're all going to be sitting down there, and I'll go, remember when you didn't do TDD? And people are going to go, oh, yeah, that was awful. How come you didn't do TDD? Well, because you hadn't practiced it enough and it wasn't on your fingers. So, in any case, I'm Corey Haynes, my Made from Dolly t-shirt. So, follow me. Thank you very much.